All right, today we are diving into program design mastery specific for the upper lower split, 4 times a week, upper lower split. So, the upper lower split is one of my all time favorites. This is exactly why I made my 8 week program, which just dropped one of them, an upper lower split. Because the reality is, for 90% of clients that I work with, clients have been training for years, we can still achieve great strength and hypertrophy outcomes following an upper lower split. It's a great option for many. When we get very advanced and we do need to push the volume even more, then that's where we can talk about, okay, potentially we're going to train with an upper lower, upper lower, upper split. Or we're going to dive more into 5 to 6 times a week training in general. But for 90% of the clients that want to build function and aesthetics, so again, get strong, pack on some lean muscle, men and women alike, the upper lower split is such a good option. So today, I'm just going to go in on the basics of program design. Now here, I'm going to take you through, basically over here, I've written up a template for how I would program an upper body day and a lower body day. And then I literally have 2 days from my program functional aesthetics within here for you to check out. Now, that said, I'm not going to give the whole program away, of course, but I wanted these real life examples so I could really help illustrate this more. So actually, first and foremost, though, I want to start with cardio. So again, when we're talking about this idea of functional aesthetics, so basically, how can we give our clients, how can they have it all? Basically, we're well conditioned, we're strong, but we also look like we lift. So essentially, this idea of functional bodybuilding. And that does come along with some cardio. So how I like to lay this out typically is we have one aerobic session. So here, this is a progression. I believe this is in the first 4 weeks of functional aesthetics. So here we are doing something, basically we're doing rower intervals. Now, this is very much pushing our client's aerobic system. And the reality is the cardio we have programmed here, if we go about it properly, it's not going to kill our client's gains. It's actually going to help. So basically, to understand how we program this, we need a better understanding of the energy systems as a whole. So basically, when we're talking about energy systems or how your body produces, like takes what you feed it and produces energy to go through like your cardio or your lifting activities or whatever day-to-day activities we're going through, it relies on two primary energy systems. We have your anaerobic system and your aerobic system. Anaerobic means energy is produced without air. Energy is produced with air or oxygen. So our anaerobic system is really what fuels the first like 40 to 60 seconds of explosive exercise. So here, basically the first 10 to 15 minutes or 15 seconds, of explosive exercise are going to be fueled by, and within our anaerobic system, we have the alactic system and the lactic system. So typically the first 10 to 15 seconds of explosive exercise are going to be fueled by the alactic system, which is primarily fueled by creatine phosphate. From there, and that's why you'll notice, basically as we transition through energy systems, now also realize that with energy systems, it's never like just one. All of these energy systems come into play most of the time. It's just which is the predominant system we're using currently. So for the first 10 to 15 seconds, we're primarily training that alactic energy system, which again is primarily fueled by creatine phosphate. So from there, and this is why you'll notice after the first like 10 to 15 seconds, we kind of start to run out of gas, right? Our ability to produce force slows a bit. That's because your body can't keep up with the energy demands. It has to switch over to a different, basically primary fuel source or energy provider, which in this case is going to be our lactic system. Still within this anaerobic system, but it's not quite as efficient as producing energy, but we can go for a longer duration here. Again, about 40 to 60 seconds. And then again, we'll see kind of this drop off as if we keep trying to produce energy or if we have inadequate rest, where primarily our aerobic system takes over. Now here, our aerobic system can fuel us for a very, very long time, but it can't create energy as quickly, which is why, again, like our rate of force production or to even think like our rate of movement has to slow down. So when we're talking about anaerobic systems there, just the basics that you need to understand, and we don't need to go too deep into that rabbit hole. But here, basically think when we're training for aerobic work, we're essentially training for your performance in your actual sets. So like here, for example, we're training 10 seconds, and this is from the second 4 weeks actually of functional aesthetics, but I plugged it in here. We're doing a sled push and a soul bike, stationary bike, or hill sprints. We're going to choose one and progress it all 4 weeks. So here we're very much focusing on training in this alactic energy system. We're taking long rest periods between sets to make sure that we don't push recovery to so little that our aerobic system, or even more so our lactic system, has to do most of the work. We want to keep these short and intense, give ourselves plenty of rest. And the reality is we could push these rest times even longer, probably up to about 4 minutes. Now, again, well, that's focusing on, I think, like our performance within like a specific rep. Here, our aerobic work, basically your aerobic system drives your ability to recover anaerobically. Your aerobic system drives recovery from anaerobic bouts. So think of an anaerobic bout as, for example, this set right here of wide grip pull-ups, or for most of us, like a set of split squats is a better example of that. The better condition our aerobic system is in, the quicker our recovery between sets is here. So if you hit your 3-minute rest period and you're still smoked from your last set, then your performance set to set is going to drop more and more. And sometimes your aerobic system can become a limiting factor. So here, whereas if this was just like, go walk for 45 minutes. Well, yeah, we're using our aerobic system. We're burning calories. We're not actually pushing the limits of our aerobic system much. We're probably not improving our aerobic capacity all that much. So here, we're programming something still that is pushing that aerobic system a little bit more. It's going to push it to improve, and it's going to help our recovery both between sets. And also realize that your aerobic system is very much tied into your ability, because it is tied in recovery, it's also tied into your ability to get your body into a parasympathetic state quicker. So when we look at your central nervous system, essentially we have two different branches. We have your autonomic nervous system, and within that, we have two different branches. We have your parasympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system, or basically think of it as sympathetic is kind of this fight or flight state where cortisol is elevated. Our body doesn't prioritize digestion, recovery, things like that, just to be better prepared to fight or flee. And that's really the state that our body is in when we're training. Now, well, that is important because, again, like cortisol is elevated, blood flow is shunted more to our limbs. Basically, we're better able to be more explosive and, for lack of better terms, lift heavy ass weight, right? But if we're in that state for too long, recovery never happens. So we also need to be able to get into this parasympathetic state, or rest and digest state. Now, with a stronger aerobic system, post-session, we can get into a parasympathetic state quicker. So, which in turn helps recovery, which essentially equals more gains. So that's why it makes sense for us to program cardio in like this occasionally. Especially, again, if we're chasing this kind of all-around functional bodybuilding style of training where we're strong, we're functional, we're well-conditioned, and we look great. All right, so in a nutshell, that's the thinking behind cardio. Throughout this entire 8-week program, Functional Aesthetics, which the link to this is in the notes below. If you want to hop on board, I have one aerobic day, which again is really pushing your aerobic system, and one anaerobic day. All right, and then let's go ahead and actually dive into the upper body days and lower body days. So within an upper lower split, typically we have 2 upper days, which will typically be days 1 and days 3. And I have all this kind of convoluted here just so I could lay all this out with actually giving away the whole program. And then days 2 and 4 will typically be lower days. So I want to work through our upper body day first. So of course we want to start with some type of smart primer. So here, first and foremost, when we are going to train, we want to look at what are the primary joints that we are going to be training. What are the primary joints we're going to be moving? So typically for an upper body day, our shoulders are, of course, going to be our shoulder joints, right? So then we're going to look at, to stay injury-free, what muscles really help stabilize those joints. So in the case of upper body, it's really going to be the muscles of our upper back. Our rear delts are really going to help stabilize the shoulder joints. So we know going into this, we want to activate those stabilizer muscles to stay pain free. So in this case, I really like something like a band pull apart, a face pull, a dumbbell face pull, a dumbbell back fly. Or if we are going to be working overhead more, I do like something that's going to be activate your upper back, but we're also going to be actually priming that overhead movement. So in here, in this case, a band Serrano press, which is where we're holding a band in both hands wrapped around a pole or through a loop, and we're retracting, we're pulling those bands back like we would a face pull, and then we're pressing up overhead. Lights up your upper back. Movement I use a lot actually in recovering from my shoulder issue. I really like this one. Lights up your upper back, but also gets us used to working that overhead range of motion before we actually go into a heavy press. And then from there, core activation is something that's optional. So actually, let me take it back to this idea of stabilizing muscles quick. So then like in these lower body sessions here, then we would look at, okay, so like for a squat, for example, okay, we know that the knees are a big part of our stability there. So we want to activate the hamstrings, which can help stabilize the knees. Or if we look at a deadlift, often the limiting factor for most people is, okay, I have trouble firing my glutes, and I really tend to put a lot of stress on my lower back. So, or I have trouble firing my core. So that's a good example of, okay, we want to make sure that we're doing something to help get some fire in their core. And also we know glutes and hamstrings are a big part of our deadlift. So we're also going to do like a straight leg hip bridge, for example. Whereas like for a squat, again, really focus on the hamstrings, specifically for the knees. And this more so depends on if it's a high bar squat, a low bar squat, a front squat, lots of different squat variations there. And that's why, actually, I don't have that day in here, but within our with our squat focus day of functional aesthetics, we have a lot of different options for squat pattern, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So from there, with upper body, programming core activation isn't always as important. I like to make this as quick and efficient as possible, this primer circuit. So like unless we're doing a barbell overhead press, for example, where we do use a lot of core, here it's not nearly as important. And then finally, we can do some type of explosive movement that mimics the initial metric-based movement of the day. So here, for example, our wide grip pull-up and our heavy deadlift. So what this does is basically we're priming our central nervous system to be explosive. So we don't want this to be something that actually creates a lot of fatigue. We just want it to be a quick, explosive movement. So for example here, or let's use the bench press as an example. If before I bench press, I do a bent over chest slam or some type of pilot push-up, I've done a very explosive horizontal pressing movement for like 3 to 5 reps. I haven't created a lot of fatigue, but I have primed my central nervous system when I go into this heavy press to be more explosive. So this can increase our performance here. And here, like in functional aesthetics specifically, we're focusing on both performance and building the muscle. So we want to make sure we get both of those outcomes, and this helps. So for example, here with our wide grip pull-ups, well, it is a relatively hard movement to mimic explosively. I do like the tall kneeling slam before this. Going into a deadlift, a broad jump is a good example of movement that mimics that. If this was a squat, we would probably do like some type of box jump or even an explosive squat jump. So then with our upper body days, essentially our first 2 metric-based movements of the day, I like to really program this. One day is vertical push-pull focus, one day is horizontal push-pull focus. And that dictates which 2 movements we're starting with here. So here, this is day 3. So whereas day 1 of functional aesthetics is horizontal push-pull, so we're going to do some type of variation of a horizontal press. So think like a bench press, a floor press, a low incline press, for example. And then we're going to follow that up with a movement in the same plane, but working the opposite muscle group. So here, for example, then we could look at if we were pulling horizontally, then we want to push horizontally. So our second movement would be some type of row. So like a barbell row, a dumbbell row. Here, we're starting off focusing vertically since day 1 was horizontal focus. So here we have a wide grip pull-up for 4 sets of 5 to 10 and a dumbbell seated shoulder press for 4 sets of 5 to 10. Now here, we kind of have a blend of strength focus and hypertrophy. Now the reality is science shows us that as long as effort is there, so as long as we're taking the set close to failure, we can achieve pretty similar hypertrophy outcomes training anywhere from 5 to 30 reps. That said, like here we're getting closer to 5, so it is still gonna have more carryover to like strength specific to lower rep ranges, but we're also gonna get some hypertrophy out of this. So here we're very much just focused on a set-by-set basis, week to week. We want to either be able to add a rep to what we did last week, or we want to be able to hit the same amount of reps with a little bit more load. And that very much ties into the RIR scheme we have here, or reps in reserve. Each week across 4 weeks, we're decreasing this. So 3, 2, 1, 0, 0 to 1. We deload. So basically we start over at 3 RIR. We draw out volume a little bit and we start the process over. Now, typically across in functional aesthetics, across the course of these entire 8 weeks, we're keeping these movements the same. Again, if we're switching things up too much, we're not actually going to make progress. We're not even going to be able to measure our progress, especially as intermediate to advanced lifters, people that have been training, put a couple years into the gym. Mixing things up constantly, mixing up all your movements constantly is just a good way to never make progress. We need to be able to track for months and months and months. Okay, what did I hit last week? How can I progress upon that this week? Whereas if we're always just plugging in different compound movements here, if we're cycling these every week or even every 4 weeks, we're just not ever going to actually be able to measure progress over time, because a lot of picking up a new movement is just neurological or skill adaptation. Our body is just literally getting better at the skill of it. And before we make too many strength gains, we just have to figure out how to become efficient at the movement, which can sometimes take a couple weeks, which really for most people, then like we will see a big jump in strength over the first couple weeks, but it's all just a skill acquisition, not actually, damn, I just built a ton of muscle over the last few weeks, or I built a ton of strength over the last few weeks. So mixing that up too often isn't smart. So across all of functional aesthetics, again, these metric-based movements, the first few movements of the training day, we keep the same. All right, and then going into the second 2 movements here, we're just training alternating patterns to what we hit with the first 2 movements. So whereas these were vertical push-pull, now we're going into, vertical push-pull. Now we're going into horizontal push-pull. So here we're training slightly different muscle groups. And again, this would be flipped. So day 1, upper body. Here, again, we're training a horizontal push-pull, and then we're going into a vertical push-pull. So here, whereas here, this is a slightly more lat-focused movement. This is a more delt-focused movement. Now we have a more chest-focused movement and a more rhomboid-focused movement. And that's more specific to how I cue this than like generally. It very much depending on how we perform our rows. They can also be a very lat-dominant movement. So this very much depends on who's programming it. But in this case, we make this very specific. Okay, we want this to be a rhomboid-focused movement. So basically, we are just achieving a well-balanced training program here. Now here, we're also shifting slightly towards the more classic hypertrophy rep ranges. Again, we can achieve similar hypertrophy outcomes, but here, basically, we're going to get a good pump. You're going to feel the burn more, and we're focusing on this more as like thinking of this, approaching this like a bodybuilder would if they trained a lot of functional movement patterns. So from there, then we'll go into, I like some isolation work here. Now, again, this movement here, I typically like to plug in whatever is kind of the theme of the day. And here I like to focus more on push muscles typically. So here, again, we hit this vertical emphasis. So our vertical pressing muscles, and this very much depends on the client, but how I went about it in functional aesthetics. So also, like if we know that this client just needed more focus for their upper back, for example, then we could plug in a rowing movement here. But how I went about this for functional aesthetics was, and how I typically program this, because again, we want a little bit more of this bodybuilder-esque work. Here we're looking at, okay, which are where we focus on vertically push-pull or horizontally pushing and pulling. So here, then when we plug this in, okay, vertical push-pull is more of a delt-focused training day, right? So we're capping that off with kind of a delt finisher here. So basically here, we're doing every minute on the minute sets of 10 to 12 of a kettlebell lateral raise. So here again, when we tie it back to this whole idea of being functional, here we're taking EMOMs every minute on the minute, something from CrossFit, and combining it with kind of this bodybuilding style of training. So it really gives us this cool, unique blend of all these different worlds, all these different training modalities tied into one program. So it's super fun for most people. And then likewise, but this could be like DeFranco shoulder shocker, any type of shoulder finisher. Or on day one, this would tip. So on day one, where we're focused more on horizontal push pull, this would likely be something that's focused on the muscles we associate more with horizontally pushing and pulling. So for example, this could be like a chest fly drop set. And I'm pretty sure in functional aesthetics on the first day, I had it's actually a banded deficit push-up finisher. And it's kind of a drop set. It's brutal. But you get the idea there. So from there, then we are going into our arm programming. So hang on here. This isn't right. So here we have just a superset, dumbbell hammer curls, a med ball push-up. I pretty much always program arms in here at the end of an upper body day because everybody loves training arms. And again, we want this blend of both bodybuilding and functional strength. So here we want to consider when we're programming our bicep and tricep movements, our shoulder angle, or basically where our elbow is at in relation to our torso. So here we know, okay, when we're doing a dumbbell hammer curl, our elbow is going to essentially be by our side. It'll probably drift forward some, but essentially it's by our side. Now we know that depending on where the elbow is in the curling motion, that also changes where the maximum tension is on the bicep throughout the movement. So maximum tension on the bicep when your elbow is by the side is different than if your elbow is behind the side. For example, if you were doing a dumbbell incline curl, where elbows are generally behind the body, or if you were doing a easy bar preacher curl, where elbows are in front of the body. We just change where maximum tension is on the bicep throughout the movement. So here on our first training day, we would want to make sure we switch that up to, again, elbows are either in front of or behind the body. And also we would probably want to look at our grip. So here we know our brachialis, which is essentially the muscle underneath your bicep muscle. It kind of pushes up your bicep. Is kind of like breast implants for your biceps. Your brachialis can't contribute to supination, which is basically your palm facing up. So with movements where our palms are supinated or facing up, that is more bicep dominant. So again, it makes sense to switch between, okay, day one or this day three, I have a hammer curl. So now I know my first day, I want to do something where I'm changing the elbow position and my palms are probably facing up. And then similar considerations with our triceps here. We just want to change where elbows are at in relation to our torso. So here, day one, we did something where elbows are essentially beside us. Two, I would consider this in front of us when the triceps are at full extension. Then we probably day one want to do something where we're doing like an overhead tricep extension, for example. All right, so when we're talking about our upper body training days, that is how we break it down. Then coming over here to our lower body training days, we already dived into our primer circuits. So then I really like, if we're doing this functional style of programming, I like to include like some type of deadlift pattern, be it trap bar, sumo, elevated, or conventional deadlift. It doesn't, honestly, not a huge fan of conventional deadlifts for many people. Definitely something that too many people try to force feed into the programs when it's really not necessary. I really like a trap bar or an elevated deadlift for many people. But again, we're chasing both strength and aesthetics. It's a great movement for getting you strong and just feeling like a badass in the gym. Not as good of a movement for hypertrophy per se. But again, for these strength outcomes, I'm a fan. So typically this will be day one, and similar to how with our upper body days, this will be our first lower body day, not day one. But similarly to how our upper body days were, we had these horizontal and vertical push-pull emphasis. Here, we'll typically have like glute hamstring emphasis or hinge emphasis. I would say glute ham emphasis and quad emphasis. So this is very much a glute and hamstring emphasis. day. So basically here, where on our first lower body day, we're starting with a more challenging deadlift variation. Our next lower body day, we would focus on a squat variation. So here in day 4 of functional aesthetics, which is the second lower body day, we're training the squat. And here with a deadlift, it doesn't typically make sense to program higher than 8 reps at the max, I would say. Past that point, typically people's form starts to break down. And again, if we're focusing on hypertrophy, there's other movements that make a lot more sense to plug in, like even if it was a Romanian deadlift. But with the main outcome, like if we're training a deadlift, we're pretty much training it for strength because we know that there's similar hinge patterns we could get better at hypertrophy outcomes for. So it doesn't make sense to program it in super high reps. So here, like across functional aesthetics, I know these first 4 weeks we are progressing this. So it's 4x7, 4x6, and each week we are decreasing the RIR. So that kind of feeds into 4x5, 4x4, right? We're decreasing the reps in reserve. Now here on this, I don't have you take it all the way to 0 to 1. We stop at 1, but we decrease the reps. So you should be able to add load across all 4 weeks. And then the next 4 weeks, you're progressing your 5 rep max, again, using this RIR progression. But our squat day is very much geared more towards hypertrophy. So there we're following the progression that we use here, where we have sets of 5 to 10. And damn, I'm kind of giving away the whole program, the whole squat day as well. But from there, so again, this is very much a glute hamstring dominant day. So basically you'll see how we sequence this. We're going from hinge or glute hamstring dominant to a more knee dominant or quad dominant movement to glute hamstring dominant, some core, a little bit more knee work, and some spinal flexion or some ab hypertrophy work. But on that other lower body day, we would have this flip. So we did a squat pattern that was quad dominant, and then our next movement could be something that's glute hamstring dominant, like some type of Romanian deadlift variation. Then we would probably come back to some type of knee dominant movement. So this could be like, for example, a leg press. This could be a walking lunge variation, which is probably what I'd program into, or some type of unilateral variation, which is probably more what I'd program into like a functional style of training like this. And then here we would plug in another glute hamstring dominant movement. So this could be like some type of glute finisher. And I always like to get at least one knee flexion movement within your training week. Very important, again, for you keeping your knees healthy and pain-free. So this would probably be some type of leg curl variation. And again, because we want to look functional, but we also want to look aesthetic, quite a bit of ab hypertrophy work here. So this would probably be another spinal flexion movement. But whereas here we're pulling our knees to our chest or doing like a reverse spinal flexion, with that would be a classic spinal flexion, pulling our chest to our knees. So like just think some type of crunch variation. So like a decline weighted crunch, a traditional weighted crunch, a cable crunch. All right, so from there, then when we're moving on to movement 2, again, we want this to train the opposing pattern or the opposing muscle groups, however you want to look at it, to this. So whereas this was a hinge or glute hamstring dominant, this is more knee dominant. Now here, I really like unilateral work. Again, when we're talking about this functional side of things, well, the reality is we could plug in like a leg press here. And for hypertrophy, the leg press is a great movement. But I would argue that most people don't have nearly enough single leg or unilateral work in their training. And that's a big part of, one, why people create imbalances, but 2, they can't move as well. They're not nearly as functional. The reality is in our day-to-day life, we need the ability to do things on a single leg. So this really forces us to train that. From there, again, we are going into another hinge or glute hamstring dominant movement. Here we have a hip thrust. I like a hip thrust because it's a good way to train our hinge again, but we already put a ton of stress on our spine with this movement. So we don't want these following movements to really add more load to our spine, which is exactly why, like, if we hit a deadlift here, we don't want to hit like a barbell front squat or like a barbell back squat. A barbell front squat would probably, some clients could potentially handle that. I would at most probably program like a landmine squat would be a good example of something we could plug in here. But we want to keep stress on this loading on the spine to a minimum throughout the rest of the program. So that's why I like the barbell hip thrust, a good way to add more volume to your posterior without too much stress on the spine. And then here we have a Turkish sit-up, which is kind of a combination of anti-rotation. So typically this is going to be some type of anti-movement exercise. That's what I like to plug in here. And as a whole, I like supersets with this functional style of training because they do keep the pace up a little bit. We're also pushing the conditioning just a bit with these. So you feel very capable. So the Turkish sit-up is one that I like, again, because it's an anti-movement exercise, but it's also somewhat a spinal flexion exercise. So again, we get both function and aesthetics, or basically think spinal flexion is what we do for ab hypertrophy, if we want to build stronger ab muscles. Anti-movement is what we do to actually create a functionally strong core that can hold up under heavy loads. So here we're getting a little bit of both of those. Leg extension, purely hypertrophy. Now here, I like to implement with movements like this. I like to implement different things like again, like here, EMOMs. Myo reps are another good example of like dope little things we can implement to keep clients engaged, to keep the program fun. Whereas like if we're doing just different shit like this constantly with like these first movements, you really wouldn't get an effective training stimulus. That said, like it's pretty easy to lock into a leg extension, know what you're doing very quickly. It doesn't take as much skill to learn, so we can add more variation to these movements the simpler they get. And we can also add different interesting techniques like this to keep clients engaged, but also still making progress. So MyReps is super cool because basically we know from this theory of effective reps, the closer we take a muscle group to failure, the more muscle fibers it fatigues. And we have to get relatively close to failure to fatigue muscle fibers enough to actually stimulate muscle growth. So really these last few reps before failure are our effective reps. They're the ones we get the most muscle growth out of. So here, when we're looking at this, the dope thing about myo reps is we're hitting a set at failure within the 15 to 20 rep range, but we're not resting long enough to let fatigue reduce much. So then these next 3 to 5 reps, our muscle fibers are still very fatigued. So these are still effective reps. Whereas on this first set, it took us maybe the first like 15 reps to get to really that effective rep range where we're really stimulating more muscle growth. Here, all these subsequent sets of 3 to 5 seconds rest, 3 to 5 more reps, 3 to 5 seconds rest, 3 to 5 more reps, those are all effective reps. So essentially here we're getting the training effect of if we did 4 sets of like 15 to 20 to near failure, but in a fraction of time with these little mini sets. And here the progression, we add a set of 3 to 5 across weeks. And when I forgot to mention here, our progression, we are just adding a minute per week. And again, that's across 4 weeks, not across 8 weeks, because you would be doing a lot of lateral raises by that point. And then finally, again, I already kind of touched on our thinking with our core training here. Typically, I like to plug in a true spinal flexion movement here. Yeah, in a nutshell, that is upper lower programming. So if you want to experience this full training program, to experience what it's like to run a program that I've created to help you achieve both function and aesthetics, I love this program. This is one of my favorite programs that I've ever put out. Link is below. I hope you found this helpful.